Thanks everybody for coming. So this is the exploration of real-world ThreatGrid use cases. Okay, so we're going to go over what people are doing in the field, what customers are doing, things they're doing with the product beyond just the basics. Okay? So hopefully you guys will come with a good understanding of some cool things you can do with the product. So my name is Michael Auger. I'm a senior security solutions architect on the advanced threat team. My primary role is working with partners doing technical integrations. So we have over 45 or so integrations with third parties, and I manage those. So I have to go sit down with the engineering teams. I say, what does your product do? They go through their product. I say, oh, great, here's what our product does. And then we map out the use cases, and we build those integrations that are something that's useful for the customers, right? In my background, I was an analyst or a consultant for almost 15 years. So I have a lot of in-the-field experience of complaining to vendors, why doesn't your product do this? It would make my life easier. So now that I'm on the other side, at the vendor side, I get to push that from the inside. Hopefully it makes a difference in the industry. We have the WebEx Teams, so you can join. There's a chat room set up. I'm in there. I check it when I'm at my computer, fairly regularly. So if there's any questions that come up, you guys have things you want to discuss around use cases, et cetera, feel free to jump in there. Just do keep in mind it may be a little while before I get back to you. So the agenda, the introduction, more or less just covered that. We're going to do an introduction to ThreatGrid for anybody that may not be familiar with it, and then we'll start defining what different use cases are for the product. Right? Beyond just the basics of it analyzes malware. Then we'll explore those use cases a bit more in depth and really dive into what it looks like to implement some of these use cases. And then we'll wrap up at the end. So introduction to ThreatGrid. Who has used ThreatGrid before? Raise your hands. One person? All right. So given nobody's used it, I assume nobody in here has access to ThreatGrid currently? Not even through ESA, Firepower, et cetera, submitting samples? Anybody have anything that does that? No? All right. All right. And I would also assume, given the last two questions, that the answer to this one is probably also going to be a no if nobody has access to it and they don't really use it. All right, so what is ThreatGrid? Let's define what ThreatGrid actually is. All right, ThreatGrid is malware-based threat intelligence, which is a lovely marketing phrase. It sounds great, but it's fairly nebulous. What does that mean? Right? So let's define this in more tangible terms. All right, so what is ThreatGrid? Well, ThreatGrid's a sandbox, and 500,000 plus samples are submitted to ThreatGrid daily. The samples are analyzed using static and dynamic analysis. The indicators that come from analysis are stored in a database so that you can correlate and pivot through the data. That's a bit more tangible, I would argue, than malware-based threat intelligence. At least we have some things we can identify in this. But let's break this down a step further. So 500,000 plus samples are submitted. What does that mean? So a sample is a file. So it could be an executable, could be a PDF, could be a zip, it could be dozens of other file types. But it's a file, and it's submitted to ThreatGrid, meaning that perhaps a user in the console went browse, submitted that file manually. It could be one of those integrations that I spoke about earlier, automatically submitting files, whether it's third-party or the Cisco internal integrations. ThreatGrid's currently integrated to pretty much the entire portfolio. So things like Meraki, Firepower, ESA, WSA, et cetera, they can all submit to ThreatGrid. So it doesn't matter where it came from, but 500,000 plus times per day, meaning 500,000 files are submitted to ThreatGrid every single day. Now we perform static and dynamic analysis on those files. So what is static analysis? Static analysis is about the file. What does the file look like? Right? What is the hash of the file? What are the imports, the exports, if it's an executable? If it's a PDF, does it contain active content? Right? So the static analysis, looking at the file, what does it look like? Dynamic analysis is actually looking at what that file does when it executes. So we're putting those files into a VM, and we're executing them. So 500,000 times per day. That means we're standing up 500,000 or more VMs every single day. That's tremendous scale, right? Once those VMs are up, we execute that file, and we monitor. Let's see, what's it doing? What's it writing to disk? What's it changing in the registry? Is it any network communications? Right? We track all of that. And those indicators, right? The indicators that come from that, the IP addresses that it communicates with, the files that it writes on disk, the registry keys, the file hashes. So we index all those indicators, and then we store them in the database so you can correlate and pivot through them. So beyond just showing, here's a file, you submitted it for analysis and we've analyzed it. Here's a report, here's what it did, and here's the score we gave it. We also index all of those indicators together. So if you click on an IP address, we'll show here's the domains associated with that IP address. If you click on a domain, you'll get the IPs. If you click on a file hash, it'll say, hey, here's all the file paths and file names we've seen for this file hash. Right? So it makes it really easy to pivot through that data and pull out intelligence that you can use in your organization. Right? So it's a little more concrete definition of what ThreatGrid is. With that, let's jump into a demo, show you guys what the product actually looks like, get a little bit of familiarity, we can baseline with that, and then we'll jump into those use cases. All right, so the screen you see here, this is the ThreatGrid console. This is what you see when you first log in. The dashboard that you have is a high-level overview for your organization. And it's specific to the samples that you have submitted. So as devices are submitting samples, you can log in, you can say, hey, show me all the stuff in the last 24 hours, the updates, give me the stuff in the last week, give me the stuff in the last 30 days. The dashboard updates dynamically, gives you stats about what's going on in that time frame. Got a bit of a brag bar up at the top to give you high-level information. So what was the average analysis time? By default, our analysis is 5 minutes. That can be extended up to 30 minutes in manual submissions. We get the average threat score for all those samples. The number of convictions, meaning the number of times a sample has scored 95 or above, and we've convicted that file across a Cisco portfolio. The full number of submissions in that time frame. So in this case, my organization has over 8,000 submissions in the last 30 days. The unique submitters, so how many unique logins or users, could be a device, are submitting to ThreatGrid. And the unique file types we're seeing. And in my organization, we've seen 143 unique file types being submitted to ThreatGrid in the last 30 days. Next in the dashboard here, we've got just a breakdown of all the recent samples. Hover over these and see just the screenshot of the last thing that was happening on there and get an idea of what was the sample doing. The next few bars here is just, again, high-level information for your organization. So what are the threat score breakdown of the submissions we've seen? What is the breakdown by day? And we can also view this by completion status. So was it completed? You can see, we have a few failed in here, but they're still such small numbers that they're not quite showing up on the graph. We can highlight over these and see where they are. You can see kind of the trending of convictions and when those are happening throughout the day. This can be really interesting in an active organization that has deployed sensors, et cetera, and to see, we usually get this spike, especially looking in the last 24 hours, we usually get this spike before noon. And just being able to pull out some of that data is really interesting from these dashboards. Then we look at the source type, meaning where did the file come from? In my case, I've only got users in my organization, but if you had firepower devices or ESAs, it would break those out as well, and they'd have their own bar here. Then just continuing with high-level info, just all the file types that have been submitted, the total counts, and we can see the bulk of what we have in here, over 50% is PDFs. Then the last thing here that I really want to touch on that's interesting is the sample submissions. And we have this red bar up at the top. And this represents our rate limit, meaning how many samples my organization can submit in a single day, in a 24-hour period, and it's 10,000. We can see down here the bar is quite low, it doesn't come up. We have customers that are submitting and hitting that limit, right? And this is a really easy way to come look at that and say, well, are we exceeding our rate limit or are we fine? It's really useful information that can pull that right there. When you submit samples of ThreatGrid, obviously you can do it through those integrations that I mentioned. We can also submit manually. So we can come into the product, say, hey, I want to browse to a file and submit that. I can also submit a URL. I can tag those samples when I submit them. So I can say, hey, this is part of a campaign, or this is part of something I'm researching. And you can tag all those samples and just easily search on those tags and pull that group of data back. We have the concept of privacy, meaning if you submit a sample as private, only you as the submitting organization can see that submission and the analysis results. There is also an appliance for ThreatGrid. It's all the same code as running in the cloud, but just on-prem. Because it is on-prem, obviously, it's not as easy to update as the cloud. So there's maybe up to a 6-month lead time for some of the features to make it, but it is updated at a fairly regular cadence. We have the ability to choose the virtual machine we're submitting to. So we've got Windows 7, which is usually the default. Well, the default now is use best. So if you submit specific files, like a Hancom or Ichitaro file, we'll automatically choose the correct VM for that to run in. We've got Windows 7. Profile 2 is Windows 7, which is updated versions of the applications that are in that. We have a Windows 7 Japanese variant and a Windows 7 Korean variant, which is actually, this is the only place I can talk about these, and it's actually relevant. But those have Hancom and Ichitaro, which are word processors for those regions specifically. So you can have the Hancom files or Ichitaro files. We'll be able to open those. Word and the Office suite is also available in there. So you can set those as your default if that's something that you're dealing with in some of your branch offices. We also have Windows 10 available. We have the concept of playbooks. So you can choose a playbook when you're submitting a sample. So if you have a sample that is an installer and you need to click OK, you can, for example, choose dialog OK. And what that'll do is when that sample is running, it'll automatically click OK and do those installs for you. This feature is being developed a bit further so that we'll automatically select the playbook for you based on static analysis. So with Word files in a macro in Word, there's what's called a on-close execute macro, meaning you open the Word document, the Excel spreadsheet, whatever it may be. Nothing happens. The macro doesn't run until you close the application. And this was implemented by malware authors to evade sandboxes, right? Because most sandboxes just open the file. What does it do? Well, most sandboxes aren't going to close the application. They just let it run. And so we do static analysis on that up front. We can see that that macro exists. And once we implement the next version of this feature, we'll automatically select the, hey, run this playbook. We know this needs to close. So it'll open in Word. Word will stay open for 2 minutes. We'll close Word. We'll get the execution. That'll happen automatically for you. We also have a neat feature that's fairly new called network emulation. So there's a couple features here. Default is none. You can set it to as needed or all simulated. So what happens with as needed is it has an active internet connection, like choosing none. But when it tries to reach out to a domain that doesn't exist, will respond as if it does. Right? This is really useful for samples, especially older samples, where you're doing research on it and you need the infrastructure to be there, but the campaign is over. The infrastructure is not there anymore. So when it tries to reach out to there, there's nothing there. And so you can use that as needed to get some of that. And then the all simulated has no internet connectivity at all. And where customers leverage this is when they have things that, hey, we have this in our environment, we've seen it, but we don't want it reaching back out, but we do want to analyze it as though it could. So you can select that, simulate all network traffic. We'll be able to do that for you. We have network exits around the world as well. This is really useful for doing research around geolocation-specific malware, where you can say, hey, I want this traffic to come from Japan, or I want this to come from Russia. And by enabling this, it's really, really cool how it's done. Right? So layer 2 frame forwarding at the VM. Right? So everybody here is a big networking company, big networking show. You look at the OSI stack, it's literally layer 2 at the VM. We're just taking that and saying, this exists over here, and we just route that across the internet. And as far as the machine is concerned, as far as that VM is concerned, it's plugged in that location. So super, super slick how that works. Works incredibly well. This can also be leveraged for appliances. So if you have concerns about, well, I've got active malware running on this appliance, I don't want this coming from my network space. Maybe I'll get banned, whatever it may be. You can configure the appliance to use one of these network exits as well, which is a very useful feature. All right. Last thing we'll talk about here, I lied. Second to last thing we'll talk about here is the runtime. So we can check the runtime. Default is 5 minutes. We can change this up to, for most people, it's 30 minutes. I'm internal, so we have a little bit longer runtimes. But 2 minutes to 5 minutes, 5-minute intervals up to 30 minutes. In case you want to play around with that sample a little bit more, you can do that. We also have the password capability. So if you have a zip file that has a password that's not this industry standard of infected, or you have a PDF that requires a password, you can submit that password with the file. We'll be able to use that password and open that up. So once the file is submitted, this is what you get in the portal. When you go to the active submission, you'll notice here we've got a unique sample ID. So ThreatGrid is based on sample IDs, meaning if you submit one file 10 times, we will generate 10 unique sample IDs, one for each submission. As far as ThreatGrid is concerned, if you submit it to us, we're going to run it. We don't care how many times we've seen it before. We're always going to run it if you submit it to us. Now, the reason for that is because, again, we're going after malware intelligence. And if we're not running those samples, we can't see how those things change. So as infrastructure changes for a campaign, as infrastructure comes up and down, if we're not running those samples, if we just say, oh, I recognize this hash from a week ago, here's that old report, well, that's not going to build much intelligence. And so we always run the samples when we receive them. We have an old talk that we used to do called The Year in the Life of an MD5, where we had a sample that we submitted every single day for a full year, and then we just tracked how all that changed, and we whole presentation around it. It's really fascinating to see how the authors and the campaigns change over time and see how they redirect their traffic as infrastructure gets taken down, and just how those things evolve and how they'll go dormant for 2 months at a time and then all of a sudden pop back up. Other things in here, you see any tags that you've supplied with the sample. If you scroll down to the bottom, we'll just do a lookup on the hash, and so you'll get some indication of, well, here's other samples that have that hash. This has been submitted before. And so you can very quickly, as an analyst, get an idea of, well, is this file good or bad without waiting for your analysis? Just being able to look at these and maybe pivot into these and get some context around that right away. And then you see this screenshot. This is more than just a screenshot. This is a feature we call Glovebox. This is full console control of the sample while it's running. Right? So I can come in here and click. I can do whatever I want in this machine. I can enter text. I can shut down the machine. Full console control. This is a really fun feature. The primary use case for this, and we'll go over this a bit more in some of the use cases, is phishing URLs. So people submit URLs they need to verify. So this gives them a really useful, consolidated area that their team can submit those samples and have everything right there without having to have each analyst have their own VM infrastructure. The other place where I end up using this a lot is DLLs. So you have a DLL that has a custom entry point. You want to see what it does when it executes at that entry point. So you can come in here, submit that DLL, come in here and execute that DLL with that entry point. Run DLL, entry point. Be able to get those executions. So malware analysts really like this feature. There's some really cool stuff we're building around this coming down the pipe that's going to make it far more useful for the malware analysts and the reverse engineers. So once the analysis is complete, this is what the report looks like. Per analysis, we can download the original sample. This is provided to you in a zip file with the password of infected. We can download an HTML report, which is basically this page, but all offline. So you can save that with your cases, et cetera, just offline. I've got the analysis JSON, which is basically with the data where all of this is stored, where this report is generated from, lives in that analysis JSON. So you can pull that back, reparse that however you choose. We've got the network PCAP, so all the network transactions that occurred during analysis, you can pull that down, reanalyze that however you see fit. I've got the process JSON, which is very granular information about what was happening with each process and when during the analysis. And then a timeline JSON, which we use to generate a visualization. Also the runtime video. And each of these, again, can be downloaded. You can do this via the APIs as well. The product is fully API driven. When we built the first version of ThreatGrid, it was APIs only. We showed the customers, and they're like, that's lovely, you have these APIs. Where do I click? And so we had to build all this on top of those APIs. And that's all fully documented in the product. So coming back here, I mentioned the timeline. So you can click on this, and this will give you that timeline visualization. And you see here we've got just network streams, registry activity, mutex is selected, and process creation. And this is maps. Each one of these is mapping, hey, this process connected to this IP at this time during that analysis. And you can zoom in and out and do a lot of cool things in this. We also have a process graph, which shows the relationships between the files. I've closed this because it's the start of the VM. See the red one up here is our submitted sample. It spawned these, so here's a child and a subchild of that. I can click on that name, it'll pop up and give me more information about it. So it's a really quick way to visualize the relationships of the files or of the processes during that analysis. So jumping back over to the report, it's broken down into multiple sections. You can see over on the left the different sections, the metadata, indicators, et cetera. Well, that analysis JSON is broken down into those same sections as well. So if you only care about network streams, you can query just that section of the JSON. You don't have to pull the same thing via the API. Up at the top, we've got a threat score. This score ranges from 0 to 100. 100 is kind of reserved for known bad things, meaning if something scores 100, we're typically naming a malware family that's associated with it. Not always, but for the most part. 95 is unknown bad things, meaning this did enough stuff dynamically when we observed it to determine that it's malicious. We are willing to take a blocking action across our portfolio on this file. We aren't necessarily naming a malware family, but it's worth blocking this. So anything under 95, a lot of customers will see, well, okay, you're blocking on 95. I want to set that back to 85 because that'll get even more bad stuff. Well, that's not quite how this works. There's a bit of nuance to this threat score. Because we're a behavioral analysis engine, we can with very high confidence tell you that something is malicious. We can never tell you if something is clean. Right? If I take an installer, my favorite example is Ninite. For anyone that's not familiar, Ninite is an open source installer. You go to Ninite, you click, I want to install Mozilla, I want to install Firefox, I want to install. They've got like 70 different packages you can select. It'll give you a very small executable. When you run that executable, it will go fetch the installers for each one of those files that you selected. It will run them silently in the background and install them. Very useful from an operations perspective. But let's consider what that behavior is doing. We have a very small executable that is downloading additional executables and executing them. When they're executed, they're changing things on disk, potentially registry keys like startup or run. From a behavioral standpoint, those are all legitimate behaviors. But in the context of malware, hey, this could be very bad. This is a persistence mechanism by putting something in the auto run or putting something in the Windows startup, right? So we can never tell you something's good. So we'll see those behaviors, and we'll score those 90 because they're legitimate behaviors, but they can also be leveraged by malware. So the way to think of this threat score is the potential for harm if the sample is malicious. And there's quite a bit of nuance in that. And again, that's the potential for harm if the sample is malicious. But 95 and above is our cutoff for this is malicious. We will take a blocking action on this. Right. This score is generated by these behavioral indicators. We have well over 1,300 of these at this point. Each one of these behaviors, we have the name of the behavior, and if you expand this out, we have a description of that behavior. And that description is really geared towards a tier 1 analyst or somebody that doesn't have as much experience with malware. And it's really contextualizing for this behavior, what does that mean when malware is doing that? Right? Because a lot of these behaviors, again, putting something in the auto run, that's a legitimate behavior. But when malware does it, what does that mean? And so a tier 1 analyst can kind of come read some of these and get some context to what that behavior means. We've got the scores for these behaviors as well. And then for each behavior, we're pulling out specific information from the report. So in this case, it's downloaded a PE executable with an image extension. We can get the artifact, and we'll talk about what that means in more detail when we get down there. We've got the name, so task.jpg. It came from this IP address. It came from this domain. So this is pulling that pertinent information right up for you. And again, it exists further in the report, but this way you don't have to go digging for it. It's just brought up straight to the top, so you can access it very easily. The next section here is the network section. So this is broken down in multiple sections. HTTP traffic, so anytime we have HTTP traffic, we break that out. Remember that initial behavior we looked at, downloaded task.jpg, which was actually an executable. We can see the HTTP stream right here. We can see it was screen.space, port 80, and we can see just that direct path. And again, the actual content was in fact an executable. We see the DNS traffic. Here we've got the queries and all of the results of those queries, all the answers that we were provided during analysis. And that's important because, again, remember, as we submit these things, as these answers change, we're indexing all of that so we can track those changes over time. Then the network streams or TCP streams. This is kind of a NetFlow type breakdown of all of the network traffic we observed during the analysis. If we look down further, we can see that this stream here was to port 9001 to this IP. Not many packets, not many bytes, but there's a whole bunch of these to port 9001. Having done this for a long time, I guarantee you this is connecting to Tor. No question in my mind that's what's happening with this. But that's why this data is here. So as you learn how to deal with this, as your analysts who are versed in these things, they can just quickly glance at these things and get a good understanding of what's going on with this sample. We have this extracted domains feature, which all of the domains that were effectively part of the analysis, specifically this was put in for documents. So we'll parse those documents and extract the domains out for you. That's what would be populated here. We've got our process section. So this is every process that was analyzed during the sample submission. The submitted sample is, of course, analyzed. We also choose to analyze children and subchildren, and then also any process that executes after the submitted sample is executed. So that's how we choose what to analyze. then artifacts. So I mentioned we talk about these. An artifact for us is anything that was on disk, in memory, or traversing the network during analysis. Beyond telling you, hey, there's this file, it was written to disk, here's the hash of that file. We make these things available for you to download, right? So you can come over here and click download, be able to download those artifacts and do further analysis on those. We'll go through some interesting use cases for that later. Last couple sections, registry activity, file activity. These are things that are in the process section, just aggregated by action rather than by process. So this gives you a pretty decent idea of what our analysis looks like, how to kind of navigate some of the product, and some of the value you can get out of parsing through some of this data and all these indicators, right? And again, 500,000 times per day we're generating a report like this, and we're indexing all the things out of this. So all those IPs, all those domains, the file hashes, the file paths, the registry keys, et cetera, those are all indexed so we can search on them. So with that, let's jump back over to the slides. Let's jump into what some of these use cases are. So what are some of the operational and less fun use cases for ThreatGrid? Well, we've got account management, right? Creating your users, managing your users. We've got reporting. So just like that dashboard had some reports, there's some other really interesting things that can be done there. And these use cases, they may be done by an analyst. They may be done by the Security Operations Center. But it could be by the Security Operations team, right? The team that supports those people. And generating those reports and being able to pump them back up to the executives and say, hey, here's the value we're getting out of this product, right? It's an interesting use case, but not really the core tenet of the product. What are the primary use cases for ThreatGrid, right? We kind of covered these. Submitting samples for analysis, using the data, so really pivoting through that data that's available. The curated feeds, which we'll talk about. And these are just kind of an intelligent grouping of the data as we're generating all of this intel. Then the sample analysis collection, this is, hey, my organization is submitting 4,000 samples per day through our various integrations, our various sensors in our environment. I want to be able to collect all that data in one place so I can index it and query against other data sets. I kind of call this the Splunk use case, right? I just want to pull all this in and archive it. So let's jump into account management. With account management, we have a handful of things we can do. User provisioning. Right? So creating, deprovisioning, et cetera. We can change secrets. So we can do password resets. We can change API keys. We can send password reset emails straight from there. We can also manage rate limits. So you may have a device that is very noisy for whatever the reason, and you don't want it to take all of your submissions. You can set a rate limit on that and say, hey, I'm only going to give you 200 samples per day. At that point, I don't care. Or maybe there's a user that's just annoying everybody and constantly submitting stuff, and you say, hey, you're taking too much of the quota, we're just going to limit that. So you can set those rate limits. You can do that, of course, in the UI and in the API. So for user provisioning, how many people here, I would imagine that's probably most, if not all, work for an organization where you start your job, somebody new starts, and they spend the first 2 to 3 weeks just getting access to the environment, right? A couple days to get their laptop, a couple days to get access to their email, a couple days to get logged into all the different systems they need to use. We have a customer that had this same problem. It took, on average, 3 weeks for a new hire to be up to speed, to have access to everything. As part of trying to streamline that, they leveraged the fact that they could do this in ThreatGrid. So they put this as part of their provisioning process for the user. They would leverage the APIs. When the user was created, they would auto-create that user, if they were in the correct OU, a ThreatGrid account. And so that, by the time the analyst sat down, was logged in the first couple days of onboarding, they already had access to the tools that they needed. And it just really streamlined their workflow for them and got the most value out of those employees. Because there's no point in, oh, great, we've got this employee, but the first month they're not doing anything because they can't. And they wanted to help eliminate that. So they were able to do that. How many people here have worked somewhere where you have left, either on your own accord or fired for some reason? I'm not going to judge. But you still had access to things, right? A month later, it's like, oh, I can still log into this. I can still log into this. And people just aren't tracking that. Well, you can deprovision in ThreatGrid as well, right, via the APIs. So that same customer, they configured all their systems that when that AD account was deprovisioned, it would deprovision their ThreatGrid accounts. Right, so it's really streamlining use cases. And again, they're not the core tenants. It's not the really fun, interesting things. But they're use cases that exist, and it's things that can be leveraged and customers have in the field. Right, so send password reset emails. Obviously, in the product, you go to log in, and it's got, I forgot my password. You can do it that way. But maybe you have users that aren't really leveraging ThreatGrid, but you don't want to call them out on it necessarily. So you can be kind of passive aggressive with this, and we have a customer that has. We'll just send password reset emails. Hey, we've noticed you haven't logged in 30 days, reset your password. So interesting things like that. Additionally, if there's a breach for some reason, you can reset those passwords right in the product very easily via the APIs. Let's jump into reporting. Get a little more interesting, a little more fun. So things you can do in reporting. Right? You can monitor the organization stats. So like we saw on the dashboard, you can see what's going on, what's being submitted. And this is great for executives, showing here's the value we're getting out of the product, the things we're seeing in the product, et cetera. We've got monitoring user engagement, so who's logging in, who's not, tracking those sorts of things. Discovering misconfigurations, and I don't mean in ThreatGrid, I mean other places in the environment. We'll dig into what that means and how that looks. You can also verify subscription needs. So we showed that graph in the UI. You can programmatically pull that data via the APIs, should you choose. But ThreatGrid's sold based on a subscription model, and luckily there's no salespeople in here, so they won't be too mad until they watch the video later. But so you're the customer. You're paying 10,000 samples per day because you don't know how many you need necessarily when you first purchase. But you're monitoring, you never submit more than 2,000. Well, if you're keeping track of this information with this reporting, come time to renew, you can renew at a lower level. Of course, the sales guys, they're going to be pissed that I said that. But it's true, it's doable, and it's going to help save money. Now you can use that for something that you're actually going to use. Right? So let's jump into these organization stats. We've kind of covered some of this high level. So when you're in the dashboard, you may have noticed there's little dots in the dashboard. When you click on those, it gives you a little modal, says Show API Query. When you click that, you get another pop-up. And what this has, and the reason this is here, is to get people using the APIs. So if anybody's used APIs before, when you first get a product, you spend a lot of time reading, a lot of time learning. You want to do a thing, you're certain it could be done, but you don't know what the endpoint is to query. You don't know the parameters you need to use to get that information you're looking for. And so we're trying to make that as easy as possible for throughout the product. So if you wanted to get just your threat score for the last 7 days groupings, this is the data you'd query. You just click on it in the UI. It's like, hey, I want this data programmatically. Right, so you can click on this link, and we get that curl example right underneath this, but you click there, it returns the JSON that was used to render that piece of information in the UI. What this means for the customers is you can build custom dashboards based on this data. Right? You can build custom dashboards that have it up in your SOC, up on one of the monitors, showing different pieces of information that you're interested in tracking outside of just the console. Right? Very, very doable. You can also generate reports on a timed basis rather than just those live dashboards. But all that's available for you very easily through the product. Going back to the console, we've got a reports section up at the top. I don't know if anybody noticed that earlier, but it's there. Go to reports, you get much the same data that was in the dashboard, broken down into a lovely format, which this looks lovely. But what's the point? Why would you have this versus just the dashboard? Well, one, it gives you the historical context for 3 months worth here. But the really important part here is when you go to print. Look at that print preview. Look how clean that is. Right? So you get 3 pages that's all formatted out in nice PDF. So you can now take that to your executive very quickly, very easily, store these, archive purposes, et cetera, and have that data very accessible. Right? So monitoring user engagement. You as customers, you buy products. The world is moving to a subscription-based world where you buy a number of seats. Right? You're paying for your products. This is going to, 5 users is going to be $5 per user per month. That's not quite our model, but it's the idea. It's unfortunate with how many things that we purchase and we give people seats, but they never leverage. Right? Millions of dollars, I would wager hundreds of millions of dollars per year are wasted on seats that a company is paying for an employee and they never use the resource. So we can monitor that engagement in ThreatGrid and really make sure that the people that have access to it are leveraging it. And if they're not, we can maybe deprovision their user and hand it to somebody else. And we have customers that have done exactly this. Right? A couple ways to do this. We'll show it in the UI, but again, it can be done in the APIs as well, programmatically on an ongoing basis. If you're an organization administrator for ThreatGrid, you can click administration up at the top, go to your organization, manage organization link here, and when you scroll to the bottom, it has all of the user activity for the organization. Right? There's my user, I logged in, you can track that. We can also track failed login attempts. Right? I mentioned being passive-aggressive with reset emails. So you see password log, or the failed password attempts, or failed login attempts, excuse me. You can then ping that user. Why aren't you using a password manager? How are you failing to log in? Right? You can kind of tease them. But again, it gives you an idea. You see the logged ins, you see who didn't log in as a consequence. Well, here's these accounts that exist. They're active, but they've never logged in. Now you can sit down with that analyst, with that employee, and say, hey, we've got this resource. We make it available to you. Why aren't you using it? And then you can have that conversation to understand, well, what would make it more useful for them, right? All right, so we'll back up a step. So discovering misconfigurations. So this isn't so much about in ThreatGrid, but like I mentioned before, in the environment itself. So we have 3 customers that have discovered misconfigurations in their environment. The one we're going to talk about had multiple ESAs. So email security appliances. Familiar? Maybe. So it's our email bot, or our email security appliance, handles email, it queries AMP, it does a lot of really cool things, submits attachments to ThreatGrid for analysis. You can cluster them and put them in different zones in the world, and you can load balance between them and all sorts of cool things. So I had a customer that had them for quite some time prior to Cisco acquiring as IronPort. They had them set up in clusters, and they had load balancing between them, and their intention was that we would just distribute the load evenly between our load balancers, or from our load balancers to our ESAs. They got ThreatGrid, they enabled it. They were really happy with it. They're constantly renewing, upgrading. They configured ThreatGrid. They looked at their sample stats over a period of time. And they were seeing graphs like this. So this graph is showing the number of submissions per ESA. Does anybody see something that stands out there? Just a little bit. ESA 12 was submitting over 90% of their samples to ThreatGrid. That seems a little weird for something that's supposed to evenly distribute your email traffic. Now, I suppose it is technically possible that ESA 12 was the only one that was handling stuff with attachments that happened to be unknown and submitted to ThreatGrid. Technically possible. Not probable, but could have been the case. So when they observed this, they went and started digging into the configurations. And they found there was a misconfiguration in their load balancers that was favoring ESA number 12 the majority of the time. Right? And they'd been running this for years. And they didn't notice that until they had ThreatGrid enabled. They were seeing the submissions, getting that feedback loop into the environment. But another customer had a similar thing, but with the Firepower devices, where they were noticing that the vast majority of their submissions were coming from 2 Firepower appliances. They had multiple throughout their environment. Well, why is that? Right? Being able to pull out this reporting and discover those misconfigurations of, well, it turns out our traffic's being routed incorrectly. And they can go make those changes based on kind of this feedback loop of an output from sensors in their environment. So let's jump into submitting samples. So this gets a little more fun, a little more interesting, kind of more of the first core tenet of the product. And this is really the cornerstone of the entire product, being all the data is generated from our submitted samples. Some of the interesting things you can do here, right? So you can automate some workflows, streamline some workflows. And we can also enrich samples with tags. Go through some examples of what these things look like. So we can submit from a file share. Well, it's not a default feature of the product, but we have APIs, so it can be built out. And probably 7, 8 customers I know of have done this, probably more. So what does it mean, submit from a file share? Well, you've got analysts. Maybe not all of them have access to ThreatGrid, but they have things they need to get into ThreatGrid. So you can set up a file share on your network. The analysts can then easily just drop a file on that file share. It gets submitted to ThreatGrid. Super easy. Right? And there's all sorts of other neat things you can do in how that workflow looks. Some people just fire and forget, drop it on, it gets submitted, delete the file. Others will drop it on, wait for the analysis to come back, and then move it to a new folder saying, hey, this is malicious, or they'll move it somewhere else based on their needs, based on their desires, based on their processes, et cetera. But really cool stuff can be done with this, and it just helps streamline getting things into ThreatGrid. Oh, a phishing link verification. How many people here deal with phishing links? Right? This is not uncommon. So we have 2 customers I know of that have built this. They wanted their analysts to be able to verify phishing links quickly and easily. I mentioned during the demo that we can submit URLs, and it's a primary use case. Rather than having their analysts have to log into the product, submit a URL, monitor that, sit at that console waiting for it, they built this. Right. Nice page, right up at the top. They can just drop that URL in, hit submit, Each one of these windows you see is an active sample in their environment. And it just makes it very easy for the analyst to sit and look and say, which one of these looks like phishing? And on this page, that top right corner that says log in with Office, Google, Yahoo, AOL, Outlook, 100% that's phishing. And just being able to pull that data out and streamline that workflow, right? Is it saving a ton of time each time? No, but it adds up, right? When you save an analyst 10 seconds from having to log into the console, and then another 5 seconds from having to click, and another couple seconds from that, it's maybe 30, 40 seconds, maybe a minute every time they do that. But if an analyst is doing this 10 times a day, and each analyst is doing this 10 times a day across 10 analysts, that's a good time savings that they can now focus on other things, and it's really streamlining that workflow for them. So Yara rule tags. So Yara rules, for anyone that's not familiar, it's basically like virus definitions, but you get to do it yourself. They're very useful. There's a lot of fun hunting, a lot of really cool things that can be done with Yara rules. And we get asked very frequently, does Threat support Yara rules? Kinda, right? We use them on the back end. But what customers really want is they want to be able to run their Yara rules against their files when they're submitted to ThreatGrid. We don't support that for a number of reasons. One being it's very easy to write a very, very resource-intensive Yara rule. Another being it's very easy to write a very bad Yara rule that will false positive. Right? You can literally say match the letter A. If the file has the letter A, fire. Right? So various reasons we don't support that in the product, but you can still do it. And that's with the tags feature. So here's a sample that was submitted. Zoom into this section here. We can see the tags. So it's EK-RIG. EK, exploit kit. RIG is a very common exploit kit that's been around for quite some time at this point. So what happened here, customer has their Yara rules. When they submit their files to ThreatGrid, and you can couple this with the file share submission, they run their Yara rules against the files. Anything that hits when they submit the file, they just tag that sample with the hits. Now they have those correlations in ThreatGrid very easily. They can then do searches on these Yara rules and then pull back the samples that had those hits. And that's at time of submission. And that's great if your submissions are only from analysts, but that doesn't help if your submissions are from ESAs, from firepowers, or third-party devices. So you can also do this after the fact. Right? You set up a script, you set up a job that goes and downloads your samples, monitors every hour, day, whatever your time frame you pick. Download those original samples, run the Yara rules against them. If there's a hit on the Yara rule, tag the sample. Right? There's 2 customers that know that have implemented that side of it. So really useful for leveraging just the features that are available for you to get the most out of it. All right, so let's jump into the meat and potatoes here, the using the data. All right, so using the data in ThreatGrid, how are different ways we can do that? So we can query for context. Right? So here's an indicator. Contextualize it for me. Is this indicator associated with malware? Is this indicator associated with a campaign? And we can add that context very quickly many times. We can query for enrichment. So give me things that are associated with this. Right? So give me IPs that this domain's been associated with. We can query for ThreatGrid and add that enrichment. We can track malware families. Right? I mentioned we have behavioral indicators. We have around 300 something that are for malware-specific families. As a result, we can really dig in and pull out indicators and track what those things are doing over time. We can take secondary actions on indicators. Right? So a behavioral indicator fires, has some indicators. We can do extra things with that. We'll walk through some of that. Then there's quite a few other fun things we can do that we'll touch on as well. So first one, surprise, didn't mention this. Maltego, third-party integration that we have. For anybody that's not familiar, Maltego is a tool that's leveraged for visualizing relationships between a data set. It's leveraged in the security industry. It's leveraged in academia. It's leveraged all over the place. It doesn't matter what the data set is, but it makes it very easy to visualize the relationships between the pieces of data. So in Maltego, we have what they call transforms. We have some transforms that are available for any customer. They just have to have a ThreatGrid API key. They can install the transforms in Maltego, leverage that API key, and very quickly start querying the data. And so here it's showing a process name, some sample IDs associated. From those sample IDs, we pulled out a domain. We pulled out an IP. From that IP, got an additional domain. Right? So very quickly, the relationship, we know that somehow these samples with this process name are also talking to this domain and this IP. And here's an additional domain we know about that we could then further research should we choose to. Right? Just a very quick way to pull the data out and get value out of that without having to write scripts, without having to really dig in and spend that time. Just gets you up and running very quickly. So we can link directly to an element in the report. So this is a really interesting one. Speaking of saving time, how many people here have ever been working in a security operations center or even on an operations team, and somebody's working on something saying, hey, can you go take a look at this file, line number 12, this thing? You have to open it up, Control F, type it in, copy, paste, however, to get to that location in the file. Is it that tedious? Depends on how many times you're doing it in a short period of time. But it does take time. Being able to eliminate some of these steps makes everybody more efficient. All right, so we can do this in ThreatGrid. So here is a sample report. We are sitting in the artifacts section, and we want to jump to artifact 113. There's that little link. When you hover over it, that link will show up. And when you click, you get a little modal pops up that says copied, and it copies the URL to that section of the report. So when you share that URL with somebody, when they click it, they will go directly to that section of the report. And so take a look at that URL. So it's standard samples / the sample ID pound artifact row 113. And these can be generated from the analysis JSON. Right? So we have customers that when they get alerts on things, they're interested in creating a case, creating an incident, creating an alert that has as much context as possible to streamline their analyst workflow. So it's no longer, here's an alert, here's the sample and ThreatGrid that it came from of, an email came in, it had a bad thing, it talked to this domain. If you want to look at that, the standard workflow is click on the thing, pivot into ThreatGrid, scroll down to the domain. They're auto-generating those links in their alerts, so when the analyst clicks, they automatically go to the section they care about. And again, it's not a huge time saving, it's seconds here and there. But when an analyst does that 200, 300 times per day, that adds up. That makes them more efficient at their job. Being able to leverage this is extremely useful in that context. So let's add some context to some indicators. So here is a domain. This is the entity page for the domain. We want to add context to this. So over on the left side there, we click Related Samples. We can scroll down to those samples. We'll pick the top one. We expand that out, and we get a list of behaviors very quickly. There's the two behaviors. Loki bot malware. So contextually, we now know that somehow this domain is associated with Loki bot. Right? And this can be done programmatically via the API. So if I have indicators coming in as alerts, I'm the analyst, and my IDS is triggering, my whatever device is triggering on, here's this thing that we're flagging on. I want to add context to that. Is this an incident? What's it associated with? I have a lot of questions as an analyst. If I can quickly determine that it's associated with a malware family, that gives me a really good starting point of stuff to dig into further to understand, am I affected? How do I remediate? The list goes on. So you can streamline this and automate this for the alerts come in, query ThreatGrid, look for these malware indicators. If present, add context associated with malware family. That's one example of this. There's many other ways you can play with that. But again, saving time, adding context, streamlining use cases. How about tracking for new malware families? Right? I have one customer that's implemented this that I know of. We have all these behavioral indicators. You're able to track these behavioral indicators. As new ones pop up, you can then pull them, search ThreatGrid for those behavioral indicators, and get samples as they start coming in. So you query once a day, once whatever the time frame, pull those samples and see what they're doing. And as a threat intel team, as a threat intel researcher, this is great. I've now streamlined from samples that are coming in from the real world, from other customers' environments. I'm starting to streamline my collection of intelligence around that. And it may not be that I'm affected today, but if I am in a month, I've already got my intel collected, and I can easily pivot into that and get context. I can easily learn how to remediate. So what does that look like in the product? All right, so at the console, up at the top, we click this indicators page. And we'll close some of these on the left, just shrink those. We're not interested in those ones. But we'll select these. We'll say, only show me these malware indicators. So we select all those. It filters our results. Then we'll sort this by created at date. Right? So now we have all the malware indicators by created at dates, newest first. You look at the dates there. It's every couple of weeks, we're adding these indicators. These are coming out as new families come out. We have a team that builds indicators to track those families. So as a customer, I can take, we'll say, the stats or mutex detected. We pivot into this. We've got the title of that behavioral indicator, or we have the name of that behavioral indicator. And I can use that to search ThreatGrid programmatically. And say, give me the samples that have this behavioral indicator. And then I can pull those samples, and then I can start pulling out depending on what I'm interested in. In this case, this one's triggering on a mutex, meaning kind of a file lock or a memory lock for a resource. So it may not be network traffic I'm looking for. Maybe it's process names. So I can query this behavioral indicator and say, give me the process names that created this mutex. In the different behavioral indicator, maybe it's those domains, maybe it's those IPs, but I can use that to automatically build intelligence in my organization around the context of this specific malware family. And because these are updated regularly, you can just build out an environment, build out some scripts that query for these new indicators, and as they pop up, to start doing this automatically for your environment. So secondary actions on indicators. I know 3 customers that are doing things like this, and there's 4 partners that I'm helping build some of these use cases out into their products for the integrations. Right? So come to the sample, go to indicators. This top indicator here, document created an executable file. We can expand this out, zoom in on that section. Look at that SHA-256, right? So what's this behavior? Document created an executable file. I mean, a document came in, it also created an executable. That's weird. That's probably not good. That SHA-256, that could be unique. That could be something that's used all the time as the secondary payload. So as the customer, what they're doing is they're looking for this behavior. When they see these SHA-256s, they then query the environment, that secondary action. Well, am I seeing this SHA-256 anywhere in my environment? Because the initial dropper may be different every time, but that may be the same payload. So being able to take those actions has a real value. We can create a data set for machine learning. So this is a more advanced, more nuanced use case. We've got a customer, really advanced customer. They do a lot of really cool stuff. They realized that we're tracking samples, we're tracking the command line arguments, we're tracking all these things, specifically for PowerShell. We've got a lot of samples that interact with PowerShell, and we have the command line parameters. They track all of the command line parameters in their environment. So they started querying ThreatGrid and collecting these data sets. They started with 6 months of data, and then every day they'd get the new data set for samples that interact with PowerShell. They would extract the command line parameters. They put them into Splunk. They used Splunk's Machine Learning for Idiots feature to say, this is a malicious data set, learn it. Once they had that trained, they took their internal indicator, or their internal command line parameters for PowerShell and said, look at these, and if any of them look like something that could be in that data set, we want to know about it. When they enabled that, they immediately found 3 machines in their environment that were infected that they didn't know about. Right? This is one use case of building that, but what does that look like in the product? Right, so here's a sample. We can go to the indicators page. We've got a PowerShell downloaded and executable file. We can expand this out. Let's scroll down a little bit. Let's zoom in on that. There's the command line. That looks really weird. Let's break that down a little bit further. Zoom in on this. So here's a section right out of the middle. One, it's obfuscated in this really annoying uppercase, lowercase, just trying to make an analyst's life harder. I mean, it's still easy enough to read, but download file. So it's this PowerShell command is downloading a file. It's downloading it from here. Go down a little bit further in this script, or in this command line parameter. It's also writing a file to the startup directory. Right? So it downloads a file, puts it in the startup directory. What do you bet this is being done for persistence? Not to mention this was a document to begin with. A lot of weird things are happening here, but that command is intense, right? And being able to collect that and say, hey, thousands of times per day we're seeing commands like this and build that data set. ThreatGrid can be leveraged for that. Not just command line parameters, but you can do this with URL patterns. There's all sorts of really interesting data that can be pulled out of ThreatGrid to kind of build and train these data sets. So getting these out of the product, if we go back to that indicators page, you can search up at the top. So we just type in PowerShell. And then down at the bottom, we've got 38 indicators specific to PowerShell. Now, not all of them are going to be as useful as the one we used there, where it pulls that command line out. Some of them are going to be a little bit less useful for something like this, but they're available to you, right? And so just kind of spending the time going through this and see what's useful. It's easy to build these systems up to train those data sets. How about downloading artifacts? We mentioned we had them. We mentioned we could download them. What's that look like? Right, so I wrote a script for downloading the hosts file, or the Windows host file. I limited my script to 1,000 samples. The 1,000 samples ended up spanning a 7-day time frame, and I got 70 unique host files out of this. For anybody that may not be familiar with the host file, the host file is like a pre-DNS lookup. When a machine tries to go to a domain, it will check the hosts file first and say, do we have an entry for this? If so, use that IP. Otherwise, it'll do a DNS query. So here's the spreadsheet. This is the output of my script. Look at that file size, a 4 meg host file. This is just a text file, keep in mind. 4 meg. That stood out. Let's go look at that sample. All right, so we look at this sample. We scroll down to the indicators page, or indicators section, right away. Deeply malware protected. Look over here, tags, it's adware. OK, cool, we've got some context around this. Go to the artifact, or the indicators page, type in hosts. We can see modified the Windows host file. We can go to the artifact. There we are, artifact 70. It is the Windows host file. Over on the right, we can click there and download that, or you can have the script do it. Now let's open that up. There's the contents of the host file. Check out those line numbers. 2 million lines in this host file. The interesting thing about this, the lines you see here with text, these are the only ones that had content. Every other line in this was just a new line, over 2 million times. 4 meg worth. Interesting on its own, but let's dig a little bit further. Let's take this domain, put it back into ThreatGrid, and see what we can pull out. So we go to the samples page. We type in the domain there. It does a search, gives us a list of samples. Let's take this top sample here. When we click into this, let's go look at those DNS, the DNS traffic, the DNS queries. Well, those look awfully familiar. Those were the same domains that were in that host file. But in that host file, it was routing them to localhost, effectively blocking them. It's a little weird that one thing was blocking, but another thing's talking to it. Let's keep digging into this. Let's go up a little bit. Let's go to the HTTP traffic. Well, confirmed these URLs. These are the URLs that belong to those domains. This sample is actually communicating with them. It's not just doing a query. A lot of questions are building up in my mind as I'm going through this. We look at the context, or the content. We see a lot of these are executables, some plain text being posted. So it's clearly communicating and doing something. Let's back up again into the reports. Go up into those indicators. So here we go. This one came in. Look at that tag on that top one. Anonymizer gadget detected adware. So I didn't dig into this too much further. But as near as I can tell what's happening here, when I looked up the two adware families, they are competing adware. And apparently, the first one doesn't like the second one. They are going out of their way to block the second one in the host file. Right? And is that particularly interesting or useful for an environment? Probably not. But it's a really interesting thing that I found really amusing. And it just highlights the example of being able to pull down these artifacts and pull out interesting information, right? And I've seen stuff like this multiple times with different artifacts. And it makes for some really great research, some really great threat intel stuff, and also just really funny stories, right? So let's get into a really fun one. Unredacting blog posts. Every couple of months, or actually probably every week, probably if you really dig into it, you have vendors like Cisco and pretty much any other security vendor. They're doing outreach, they're doing blog posts, they're doing research. They've got threat intel teams. They've got some really smart people. They publish those blog posts, but they're frequently redacted in some way. We can leverage ThreatGrid to unredact them and pull out additional information. I do this probably every couple of months, where I will find some blog post that's about some campaign or something else that's going on, and I will find indicators and I will find other intel that they're not talking about. You can also validate and do further research very quickly with ThreatGrid. So let's take a look at a blog post here. So this is a company called Deep Instinct. They've recently written a blog post on February 19th about a new renewed campaign for living off the land attack. Now, this blog post has a lot of issues. For those who aren't familiar, living off the land means leveraging the tools that are available on the machine, so leveraging PowerShell, leveraging stuff that already exists. They also call this fileless, which is a little weird because they proceed to talk about the file that's downloaded and the files it's downloading as well. So there's a lot of issues with this blog post. It's all right. We can still have some fun with it and dig in and unredact it. So we scroll down on this blog post. We get to this section saying stolen data uploaded to legitimate FTP service. We see that it's using the ancp.exe, which is a legitimate FTP client. We see that it's sending it to freehostia.com. And we see that the hard-coded username and passwords using the credentials, we were able to access the FTP and view data organized into several clients. Well, that sounds like a lot of fun to me. Scroll down a little bit further. They show the contents of one of these files, and they say file names and credentials redacted. Let me highlight them here. So we've got these XXX, YYY, but look at the bottom two right there. Dash U XXX, dash P XXX. That sure looks like a username and password. Are they saying the username and password are the same? Because up higher it's got YYY indicating multiple values. So I'm not sure what happened here. I've got some more questions. I'm curious. Let's dig into this. All right, so we go to ThreatGrid, go to the samples page. We put in the host. I picked this artifact. We could have picked many of the others in that blog post. We picked this one. I liked this shipment documents.exe. Sounded interesting, so we'll pivot into that. Go take a look at the TCP streams. There we go, FTP traffic. That's what we were looking for. This looks like it's in line. We've got the process, ancp.exe. Looks like we've got a hit. This is probably part of the same campaign they were referencing. So we click on that. There we go. We've got 4 instances of ancp.exe. So that's that FTP client running. We'll expand this top one. Hey, username and password. Check that out. Nice and easy. Notice how they're different, though. So they're redacting. I've got some questions about this. So let's scroll down. Let's look at that next one. All right. Well, different username and password. That's cool. So that explains why there was 2 lines, 2 different username and passwords. It's still bothered about their redaction methods, but that's fine. Let's dig into this further. We'll go down to the artifacts section. We can go over, again, search. Notice how I didn't have to type the whole file name. I just put a couple characters, and it pulled out exactly what I was looking for. We can click there. We can download this batch file. Let's open that up. And there we go. We've got the same username and password that we saw in the process names. Notice some differences, though. The one the blog post showed only had 2 lines. This one has 4. The spacing is different. So what they did is they changed the contents of the file in their reporting, which drives me nuts. I find that highly irresponsible. That said, how many more things can we find? I'm not a particularly responsible person sometimes, so we can find 16. There they are. 16 username and passwords from an active campaign, pulling credentials and uploading them to an FTP service. Right? This is pulling this data out. Well, how did I do this so quickly, so easily? Well, I wrote a script. Right, here's the entirety of the script that I used to fetch this data. Right, so there's our query, saying query for ancp.exe. This line just collects the sample IDs from that initial query. And then that for loop just walks through each of those sample IDs and queries them for the process section. And this prints out, if the process was ancp.exe, print the command line parameters. So 21 lines of Python to be able to extract these. This took 2 minutes to run. Right? But being able to unredact this, being able to pull this data out in a very timely manner very quickly, really useful from a threat intel perspective. And it's a really, really fun use case for ThreatGrid, being able to find additional data. Whether you are on the customer side, maybe somebody wrote a blog post about what's happening in your company, and you can pull this out and find additional data, or maybe you're a service provider that's protecting a company that somebody wrote a blog post about, being able to pull this out, very valuable to be able to help them quickly. So we got a bonus use case. We can decrypt PCAPs. Some of you may be networking folks. Some of you may be wondering, well, how's that happening? You intercepting the traffic? How are you going to decrypt a PCAP? Well, if you look at the analysis JSON, we've got this extracted keys section. These are the master TLS secrets that we pulled out of memory. We didn't have to intercept the traffic because we owned the host. And the way we're doing our analysis, we can see everything in memory when it's happening, and we make this available. Now, there's a difficulty with this, and you can't use Wireshark to decrypt because we don't extract the nonce. We just give you the TLS secret. So you have to write your own tooling that will just kind of brute force against the however many streams are. Here's the keys, try them, and decrypt. And we're going to be executing this in the product. Not sure quite the time frame. In the next year, for sure, it should be done. We're going to automatically be decrypting all of this encrypted traffic for you in those analysis results. And we do this by extracting these secrets. In the meantime, if you want to be very ambitious and implement it yourself, everything's there for you to do it. So let's take a look at the curated feeds. So we have 16 curated feeds in ThreatGrid. You can ingest these feeds. We can also use them as a starting point for hunting. Let's take a look at what these feeds look like. So here's a list of the 16 feeds. Primarily, these are DNS. These are network-centric feeds. Look at this rat DNS one. I'll dig into this. When we do a query for this feed, here's what it looks like. This is the data that comes back. This is the JSON format. These feeds are available in multiple formats. We've got them in sticks, JSON, CSV, and snort rules. So you can easily ingest them directly as a snort rule. The primary indicator for all of these feeds is the domain. Everything else in this feed is contextual. So you notice the IPs section. The top one has no IP addresses. The second one has an IP. And this is, again, contextual. It's saying at the time of analysis of this sample, and in this case, it's a remote access Trojan. We're lumping that data together into this feed for you. This was the IP address that we saw. Again, it's just very contextual data. And you can click on some of these links. If you click on the info link, for example, it will take you to the entity page for that domain. If you click on the sample, and this is where it's very valuable, is it takes you to the sample that the data came from. So if anybody's leveraged threat feeds in here, there's a problem with a lot of threat feeds. And the vendor says, here's a list of bad things. Go look for them. And you're like, great, thank you so much. I have to take my money, give me those feeds. You implement them in your environment. You put them in your firewall. You put them in your IDS. You put them in whatever product it is that you're using. And you can tell your boss, hey, boss, no, it's great. We've got 2,000 domains per day from this vendor. We're looking for these bad things. Life is good. And then you get a hit. Something flags. Hey, the thing that you were told was bad, we're seeing it in the environment. Very quickly, you have a lot of questions. Well, why is it bad? What's it associated with? Give me some more information. And a lot of those feed vendors can't provide it. They just say, here's bad stuff, trust us. And when you do get that hit, they're like, oh, it's bad. Dear vendor, why is it bad? Because someone told us it's bad, because we got it from somewhere else that said it was bad. And it's hard to add that context. But with ThreatGrid and the feeds that we have, we drill back to the source of that intel. So you click on that sample, it immediately shows, hey, this domain came from this sample. And you can look at those behaviors and say, well, is this a malware family? In this case, we already know it's a remote access Trojan. But is it a specific family? Is it NJRAT, for example? And we'll be able to find that. You can then go look at that sample and say, what's it doing on disk? Where is it writing files? What's it doing in the registry? What keys is it writing? What values is it writing? Well, am I seeing those things in my environment? So you get that hit, you look at the source, and then you can easily correlate and say, well, is this the exact same thing? Is it similar? And it gives you a quick starting point to not only identify and verify, but also to remediate. So it's extremely valuable. It's a very nice feature of our feeds. There's very, very few vendors that give you that kind of context around the data that's in their feeds. So we can ingest feeds, obviously. That's kind of the point of them. And how do we do that? So we've got an hourly feed and we've got a daily feed. The hourly feed is from the samples we've analyzed in the last hour. And it's constantly being updated, constantly being filled with the samples from the last hour. So if you query that feed at 7 minutes past the hour, it will be the samples from the previous full hour. And the daily feed is just the roll-up of, for that date, here's all of the data that we had. And you'll notice the difference here is just one has just .json. If you wanted the CSV version, you would just say .csv. If you wanted the sticks version, you would say .sticks. If you wanted the specific day, you're just going to add that date in there. So if I wanted the feed for today, I would pull that JSON in, and I would be able to fetch that feed very easily. Right? We can also use these as a starting point for hunting. Right? So if we, again, go look at the feed, we can click on the domain, and this will pivot into ThreatGrid. And it'll give us that context around what's going on in that domain. It takes us to that entity page. So we know this is a remote access Trojan. We've already got some context. We'll pivot into the page here. And again, we have all the ability to pivot into the related IPs. In this case, there's only one. If there's anyone from TPG Telecom Limited in here, your infrastructure is being used for bad things. So something to be aware of. But it's a starting point for some hunting. I use this frequently when I have research or silly things that I'm trying to work on. I know I want to do something, but I don't know what it is. So I can leverage these feeds and easily make this a starting point for some investigation. I've lost track of the number of times I've lost a weekend to ThreatGrid, just because I find a silly thing like this throughout my week and I bookmark it and I'm going to go look at this later. And I just end up going down this rabbit hole of, well, this is related and this is interesting, and just pulling all this data in. And the tool makes it so easy that I've lost countless weekends to doing things like this and just pulling in this data. I've also found stuff where I've known people at companies that are being affected. And so I'm seeing stuff that's targeted to them, maybe with hard-coded domains, hard-coded whatever it may be. Being able to actually reach out to them and say, hey, I'm seeing this thing come in. Are you guys aware of it? And just being that starting point at one of these feeds. So we've also got the sample analysis collection. So we mentioned earlier, it's kind of the Splunk use case. So sample analysis collection, it's your organization is submitting samples to ThreatGrid. We're generating an analysis JSON for those samples. You want to be able to collect those and store them for you. You want to be able to collect those analysis JSONs and store them. Maybe you want to archive them for historical purposes. Maybe you want to archive them for compliance reasons. You have to store your data for 90 days based on whatever. But you can do this very easily. If you're leveraging Splunk, for example, which is kind of why it's a Splunk use case, you can then correlate that against your other data sets. We do have a ThreatGrid Splunk app that does exactly this. So it will query your environment and just collect those analyses JSONs and parse them out. You can then have, much like the earlier use case of taking a secondary action on an indicator, where it's this thing downloaded this additional file or created this file or changed this registry key, you can configure Splunk to look at those indicators out of your ThreatGrid analysis reports and start correlating that against the entire data set in your Splunk instance. Quite a few customers are trying to leverage Splunk for everything, all of their data points. I was just on the phone earlier this week. I forget, time's a little blurry right now. I was on the phone very recently in the last 7 days easily with a very, very large beverage company. They have exactly this use case. Right? They're working on getting all of their data into Splunk, and they want their analysts to use that as their single pane of glass, as it were, as the SIM mantra goes. And the conversation we had was around, by leveraging Splunk for this, by pulling all this data into ThreatGrid, what are we going to be missing? Right? What things will we lose out on if we don't actually use ThreatGrid as well? And so we went through a lot of the things that are in this presentation around, here's some really cool things you can do, and you can implement these use cases. You can implement that use case of querying for additional analysis, or taking that secondary action on those indicators that come out of your reports. You can quickly add context to things in your environment because you've got this context in ThreatGrid. You can very quickly add enrichment to other alerts from your environment with the ThreatGrid data as well as the data that you have. And then we also talked about the pieces that they're going to miss out on. Right? They're going to miss out on Glovebox. They're going to miss out on being able to do those active searches and do those hunting activities. And at the end of the day, it wasn't just the end of the call. It was, well, this is really great. We didn't know about a lot of these use cases. How can we implement these and make the most out of what we've already owned, what we already purchased? Right? And it's, again, just getting a customer, getting an environment to leverage the tools they have. That's why I went through some of these use cases of the user reporting, et cetera. It's just getting people to really leverage these and getting the most money out of the things they've already purchased. Right, so in conclusion, we've got a bunch of use cases here. Right? From that account management side to, again, like I just mentioned, tracking that user engagement, making sure you're getting the most out of the tools. I've lost track of the number of times in my years doing consulting when I'd go into an environment and they'd have some tool that they're using. Well, oh, that's great. I love this tool. Are you guys using it for this and this and this? Like, no, what do you mean? Well, what do you guys use it for? Oh, we just bought it for this one thing. I'm like, you know, it does a lot more than that. I said, oh, yeah, but we only needed this one thing. I'm like, oh, I can get that. It does a really good job at that, but there's some really cool stuff here, too. And they're, well, yeah, but we bought this other tool to do those things. The number of times I've seen customers that have purchased 5 distinct tools to do 5 specific things when one of those tools does all 5 of them. And it's just they haven't really dug in. They haven't explored them. They haven't had the curiosity to say, well, what else can I do? All right? So I encourage you definitely with these tools, whether it's Threcord or anything else, to really spend the time of exploring the use cases like this, right? To really going out and saying, well, what else can I do with this tool? And I appreciate that takes time. That takes knowledge. But try and find it, right? Maybe set up, say, analysts or whoever deals with these things, whatever the tool may be. You know, Friday afternoons, I just want you to work on these things, right? Really get the most out of the stuff. And people say, oh, well, we've got so much stuff going on. That's true, but would you rather have somebody take 4 hours out of their week, 3 hours, 2 hours, an hour maybe, some bit of time and focus on getting the most out of the tools, or would you rather spend another $4 million on a new tool, right? There's a cost benefit to be had there. So we've got the reporting. So being able to pull back analysis reports, be able to show value to executives, be able to track what's going on in your environment, say, hey, maybe our rate limit's too high. Maybe we should be spending less money. Or, hey, we're constantly hitting our rate limit. We need to spend more money, get more samples. Being able to do that in the reporting, and again, get the most out of the tool that you have and having it appropriately sized for your environment. To be able to submit samples, right? Being able to streamline some of those use cases of, hey, let's just drop this on a file share, get that up. Let's tag these samples when we're submitting them to get more context to our environment, to our needs. To using the data, to being able to go out and do some hunting and pull out some context, pull out enrichment for the data that you're seeing in your environment to make your analysts more efficient in their day jobs. Right? Being able to, the simple things like linking to an analysis element. So when they click, they have the data they need at their fingertips without having to Control F, open a new tab, et cetera. And it's just seconds here, seconds there. But over a big team, over a year, it comes out to weeks of time that are wasted on these things, and really streamlining those. Using that data to redact blog posts, to pull out more things, to help your threat hunting teams. To leveraging those curated feeds to just protect your environment proactively. It's contextually, we know these are bad things. Let's just put them up. That's not an extra spend if you have the product. That's something you can do immediately. So you don't have to go in and spend more money to grab that. It's leverage it. You've already got it. So few of our customers actually leverage the feeds. And it's not that any customer I talk to, we go over that they have them. We do the demo. We show them it's there, and they say, that's great. But then they forget about it. They're busy with other things. They don't implement it. But you've got it. Use it. Right? And then the sample analysis collection, right? That whether that's for archival, whether that's for compliance reasons, or whether it's just to have that data pool to be able to correlate against. Right? These are all things that are capable of. Thank you all for your time. Hopefully you guys have learned some use cases, gotten some ideas, not just about how to use Threcord differently, but how to think about some of your tools differently, different things that you can perhaps do with stuff you already have that's Cisco, maybe not. But really just get the most out of what you already own. All right? So with that, we'll open it up to Q&A. If anybody has any questions, we've got a few minutes left here that we can field those. Nothing? Nothing at all? All that cool stuff? All right, if you think of... No.
What's the Cisco security devices can be integrated with Threcord?
Yep.
We have AmpCloud, and this AmpCloud and Threcord can interact.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, the question is what Cisco security devices can be integrated with Threcord, and it's roughly the entire portfolio of security devices. So you got AMP for endpoints. So that can submit to Threcord. You can configure what they call low prevalence, which will, when a file's very rare effectively, and it's an executable, and it was executed, there's a bunch of criteria, but it can automatically submit for you. You have Firepower, which is the network devices. You've got ESA, you've got WSA, you've got Meraki, you've got, what stuff am I missing?
You pretty much got it. If you're interested in more information about
Yep.
that, I'm going to be doing the next talk
Yep.
in this room after a 15-minute break, and that's the subject of my talk.
Yep.
Michael's covered a lot of really great advanced use cases for Threcord that I found super interesting. If you just want to get the basics set up for the integrations for the products you already own, that's what I'm going to be talking about.
Yep. It stole my thunder. I was going right there next. But yeah, Ben's talk's coming up next, and it's going to cover that really in detail. But at a high level, pretty much everything in the security portfolio. If it doesn't today, it will someday very soon. I think we have everything covered, but there's a lot of pieces to Cisco, so it's hard to track. But yeah, does that answer your question sufficiently? Great. Anything else? Nothing? All right. Thank you again for your time. If questions pop up throughout the week, I'll be around. I guess we've only got 2 days left. But the rest of today, I've got a meet the expert engineer, whatever they call it. I forget. But I've got that tomorrow from 10:30 to like 12:30, I think. So I'll be out in that area if you guys want to stop by. Or we've got the WebEx Teams room as well, so you can pop in there, ask questions. I'll be around. So yeah, thank you again so much for your time. Continue your education. We've got a lot of demos, labs, meet the expert related sessions that are going on, much like the one coming up next. Please complete your evaluations. If you liked the content, if you liked the presentation, please score accordingly. If you thought it was the worst thing you've seen, be honest, score it accordingly. Really like the feedback. It's how we improve. So again, thank you so much.